Okay. So, you know, I've gone to 3 of the Bearing Witness retreats now that you've run. You started and organized. And people ask me why I do it. What am I doing there? And so I thought it would be wonderful to have a conversation about it that I could share with people who come sing with me.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people who come sing and chant with me don't have much exposure to other parts of spiritual practice. And they come in through the yoga community, the asana community, hatha yoga, and then they hear the chanting and they come. So I think it's a pretty large percentage of people who don't really have any other context for it other than that. And this is from outer space as far as they're concerned. They don't understand what it's about. And so I thought it'd be good to share that, a little bit about the process with them in the practice.
Yeah. So the first time I went to Auschwitz, it was about 22 years ago. We've been doing retreats there. This will be the 20th year that we're doing retreats. But the first time I went, about 22 years ago, when I walked into Birkenau, I could just feel all the spirits crying out, wanting to be remembered.
Mm-hmm.
And so right away I said, I've got to do that. I've got to come here and sit and be with those spirits. And then it struck me also pretty much right away that there were all kinds of spirits there, because that was a place many Jews were killed, but gypsies and Catholics and intellectuals and gays and people with handicap, so many different kinds. And so it felt like I should try to bring as many different kinds of people there to be together and to see how we can deal with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was a place where the way you dealt with differences was you killed the differences.
Right.
But to sit with each other and to do that, it was only a few years ago that it struck me that another very important piece of what we now call Bearing Witness retreats is that it's a way of helping to reduce our fear. So we're taking people to places where their first reaction is fear. Mm. I can't go there. That's horrible, man, or whatever. And in the Buddhist tradition, the word for compassion, the Chinese word for compassion, has 2 radicals. One is compassion in the way we normally think of it, and the second means removal of fear. Mm. So compassion works, the Bodhisattva's work in compassion is to remove fear. Mm-hmm. And these Bearing Witness retreats are doing that. Mm. And like I had a couple of years ago in my council group, there was we do way of council every morning, and in my council group there was a German woman who first we introduced ourselves, and she said she'd been thinking of coming for 15 years, but she was afraid to. Her grandfather was SS and ran a camp. She was afraid she would meet a Jew or a Pole. So this was a woman, I'd say in her 50s, and for 50 years has been avoiding Jews and Poles out of fear that she would run into. And in my group also was a Polish guy who lives in Krakow, and he said for 10 years he'd been thinking of coming, but he was afraid. He was afraid he would meet a German. So for all his life, he was in his 40s, he was avoiding Germans out of fear. Mm. After 4 days, they were hugging. Yeah. So it meant that the spectrum of life that they were now encountering was increased tremendously. It was decreased out of fear. Mm-hmm. And that's true for all of us, I think, that there's certain things that we're afraid of and we stay away. So we're not in touch with that part of life. And so bearing witness retreats have that effect. Same we do, we go live on the streets, street retreats. They're the same thing. People are afraid to live on the streets. They're afraid. And that manifests when they walk in the streets and they see a homeless person, they'll turn away. They're afraid to meet them.
Yeah.
They're afraid to say hello.
Yeah.
Forget about the money part. They're afraid to talk to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And anybody who's gone on a street retreat, when they see somebody homeless, they will say, "How you doing? What's your name? How you feel?" You know, that fear is gone.
Yeah.
Now to go beyond the fear and to celebrate in the diversity of life, that's beautiful. So when you come and you call all the hungry spirits to come and you... Yeah, so we all talk about the interconnectedness of life, the oneness of life. But if we look carefully at ourselves and see how many aspects of life we shy away from or won't come in contact, and then try to figure out why, I think the biggest reason is fear.
Sure.
Fear. So that's how these bearing witness retreats... Well, I don't know if they started because of that, but that's... we're enlarging the numbers. And
yeah, there was... Yeah. I had a lot of fear before my first retreat. I thought, how am I going to deal with this? Just the fear of being in that place where so much suffering happened and so much torture and so much inhumanity was manifest. I just didn't know what was going to happen to me, you know.
Right.
So just to go and go through the process and the practice of being in the camp, I'm very freeing from that fear that I had, just on that simple level. And then to be talking about fear, how much fear there must have been in the camp at the time of during the war. Right. The atmosphere was extraordinary.
Yeah. And if we just finished, we were just together in South Dakota in the Black Hills, Native American, with the Lakota folks. And the fear, the elders went to boarding schools run by the church, Catholic Church, and the fear that must have existed there, because if they spoke any Lakota, they were beaten up.
Yeah.
If they wore any traditional clothes, they were beaten up.
Yeah.
And from what I understand is now in one of those in that school, there's a track where people run around, and underneath that is graves of children that died there. So they had a reason to be afraid, you know. But that fear permeates everywhere. And that's the other reason for these bearing witness retreats is our ignorance, which I think that is most of the non-native Indians that came had no idea of what went on in our own country and what we did.
And still doing.
And are still doing. And why we have these ignorant things, again, in a way, I think it's fear. We don't want to know, because so it's fear, it's guilt, but we don't want to know. So we try to stay away. So what I found for myself, maybe about 25 years ago, actually, that I was in a place that in my practice, I needed to go to places where I didn't want to know what was going on, where I felt I had to stay away, or I was afraid of it.
Yeah.
And so those are the places I went. Now, in the old Buddhist traditions in India and in Tibet, they had what they call charnel practices, where you would go to the cemeteries and sit with the spirits that are coming in.
Yeah.
It's a very similar thing.
Yeah.
And a way of dealing with our own insecurity, our own fears, our own wanting to be ignorant of certain things, and not really grasping that that means that we are not connecting with all of that which is us. I mean, we're all one, we're all interconnected. So if we're staying away from a large part, in a way we're staying away from a large part of ourselves, and there has to be practices to bring those connections. And then I also feel very strongly that there's got to be practices that celebrate that. And those are bhakti practices and chanting practices. I mean, there's many practices to do that, but I think they take on another significance if it's also linked with bringing in the shadow or the places we don't want to know about or we don't want to touch.
Sure.
So we make a good duo, man.
Yeah. Yeah, and people are very attached to the way they live. Like one time, remember when I sang in? You asked me to sing it was in the women's. No, it was in the men's. One of the men's barracks. And so I sat down there in the mud, and one guy just exploded. Remember? And he ran out of there. Remember that?
I do.
Yeah, and I was.
He's a student of mine.
Oh, was he? Oh, he must have been a good student.
Yeah.
So he didn't want to let go of something, right? I mean, he's.
Right.
So he came back.
He didn't want to open up.
He didn't want to open up. He was there with the suffering, but he didn't want to. He couldn't let go of that. He had no. He was attached to his suffering. I guess you could say. I mean,
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And we put a lot of emphasis on our first tenet in the 17th week of not knowing, or being open, and being open to everything, you know. It's very difficult. And so he had studied that, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He was trapped by his conditioning of what should be. Instead of being open to what is. And another case like that was sort of interesting is 2 years ago. We always go to the women's barracks. There's a women's barrack where women were put when they couldn't work anymore, and they were put in there, and they weren't given food, and they were just left there to die. And so we always went there. And this 2 years ago, we decided that we would have the men go into a men's barrack and the women into this women's barrack. We did that. And when the men went in, Ohad, who's a rabbi from Israel and plays guitar, started playing some Hasidic tunes. And we were singing. There was somebody that got really pissed off. You know, how are you singing here? This is Auschwitz. You know? And then we were supposed to meet up with the women, but we went on. We were singing, dancing, and it went on so long that it was now lunchtime. So most people went to outside the camp to the trucks to get their soup, but some, including the rabbi, went to the women's barracks to see what was going on there. It turned out that one of the men was engaged to one of the women that was in the barrack. And they went, and she saw them coming, and she said, why don't we, they were going to get married in a couple of weeks in Prague or somewhere. And she said, why don't we get married? Here. He said, here? She says, yeah, why not? And they asked the rabbi, oh, can we do that? And he said, do you really want to do it? And they said, yeah, we want it. He said, yeah, I can do that. And he married them. Now, there were a number of people. There was a woman that was very upset about the women dancing and whatever. She was an Orthodox Jew. And then I pointed out a few days later, in the evening, the last evening, Friday night weekend, I pointed out that most of the people in those barracks were from the Hasidic tradition. And a wedding in the Hasidic tradition, the men are separate from the women, and they're both dancing. They're singing and dancing. And then at some point, the rabbi leads the groom to where the bride is. And they get married.
Just what happened.
And I said, that's what happened here. And can you imagine the delight of the people that were here?
Yeah.
And seeing a wedding in their tradition happening right in their space. Yeah. It was... so both of those people that were so upset said, wow, yeah, why were you so upset? We're part of history making here. But again, because they were afraid, they were closed.
Yeah.
They
and even so, being closed and afraid, that's part of the programming they received from the culture about this is how we have to live with this.
Yeah.
We have to be closed, we have to be afraid, we have to only be unhappy about it. Well, I remember when you gave me those 8 lines to work on from the
Gate of Sweet Nectar.
The Gates of Sweet Nectar. The actual translation, as you gave it to me, was the last line was, all of your sorrow, I make it mine, which is the Bodhisattva, taking on the sorrows of the world. So when I brought that to you, you said, oh, I want your joy too. You got to put that in there. So I changed it though, your joy and your sorrow.
Yeah.
But it's more inclusive. It's more.
Right.
When the first time I was at Auschwitz, I had my harmonium with me because I had been singing in Europe. So I took it into the women's barracks, and I thought, I will do some Devi Puja here. I will sing to the goddess, the perfect woman, that embodies all women. So I got in there and I put out the harmonium and I was just about to sing. And I thought to myself, well, first of all, it was so full. I don't think I've ever sang to more people than the beings I felt in that barracks, that empty barracks. And I don't have these kind of experience, but I just felt it was so full. So I asked them, what should I sing to you? And what came back? They wanted me to sing to their children. So I sang Gopala, which is the child Krishna. And I felt they felt such joy from that, because they were remembering their children and the love that they have with their children. It was a very beautiful experience, completely unexpected.
Yeah. Jai Jagadambe Ma Durga Ma Durga Jai Jagadambe Jai Jai Jagadambe